I never thought buying 2 acres of scrubby woodland would lead to a full-blown declaration of war. For most of my life, my world was confined to the familiar hum of my excavator, the scent of fresh-turned earth, and the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. I run a small earthworks business out of my home, a property that's been in my family for 3 generations. It's a good piece of land, just over 5 acres on an old county road, with a sturdy house my grandfather built, a large workshop for my equipment, and enough space to breathe. My life was ordered, predictable, and blessedly free of drama. All I ever wanted was to do my work, care for my family, and be left in peace. The world, it turned out, had other plans. My property line on the east side abutted a newer development called Willow Creek Estates. It was one of those planned communities that had sprung up in the 90s, filled with cookie-cutter houses on quarter-acre lots. For years, it was just a place. People lived there, mowed their lawns, and waved as they drove by. Their homeowners association was a sleepy, barely functional entity that mostly collected dues to maintain the front entrance sign and plow their private roads in the winter. It was a live-and-let-live arrangement that suited everyone just fine. I knew a few folks in there, good people who valued the same peace and quiet I did. We were neighbors in the truest sense, separated by a property line but connected by a shared sense of community. That all changed when Carol Peterson moved in. She and her husband bought one of the larger homes in the back of the development about 2 years ago. From what I gathered, she came from a city environment where every aspect of life was governed by a committee, and she brought that mindset with her to our quiet corner of the world. She saw the relaxed nature of the Willow Creek HOA not as a blessing, but as a failure of leadership. Within 6 months, she'd launched a campaign of whispers and promises, painting a grim picture of declining property values and creeping chaos. She got herself elected president of the board, and the age of the petty tyrant began. The changes started small, almost laughably so. An official email went out mandating that all mailboxes had to be a specific model, a hideous faux bronze affair that cost $200. Then came the edicts on lawn maintenance. Grass was not to exceed 3 inches in height. Holiday decorations could only be displayed within a specific 2-week window. A neighbor of mine within the HOA, a sweet guy named Tom, was fined $50 because he had a pink flamingo, a gift from his granddaughter, peeking out from behind a rose bush. Carol, it seemed, was on a holy mission to sterilize the neighborhood into her vision of perfect, soulless conformity. From my side of the property line, I watched with a mixture of pity and profound gratitude that my grandfather had had the foresight to buy his land long before anyone had ever dreamed up the concept of an HOA. The real trouble began on a crisp autumn afternoon. The 2-acre wooded lot that separated the back of my property from the last cul-de-sac in Willow Creek went up for sale. It was an undeveloped parcel, part of the original plat that the developer had set aside and never built on. For as long as I could remember, it had been a wild, tangled buffer of oaks and pines, a home for deer and foxes. When the for sale sign went up, my heart sank a little. I dreaded the thought of a new house going up right behind my workshop, of losing that sliver of wildness. More practically, I saw an opportunity. Buying that lot would give me a permanent buffer and a bit more space to store materials without cluttering up my main yard. After a few discussions with my wife and a visit to the bank, I made an offer. A month later, the land was mine. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, of securing the peace I valued so much. I hadn't even had time to walk the new property line before the first shot was fired. I was in my kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and looking over some blueprints when a sharp, insistent rapping echoed from my front door. Not a neighborly knock, but a summons. I opened the door to find Carol Peterson standing on my porch. She was a woman in her mid-50s, dressed in a crisp pantsuit that seemed wildly out of place on my dusty doorstep. She held a thick, professionally bound document binder, and her expression was one of grim satisfaction, like a prosecutor about to present damning evidence. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice sharp and devoid of any warmth. "I'm Carol Peterson, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." "I know who you are," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "What can I do for you?" She tapped the binder with a perfectly manicured finger. It has come to the board's attention that you have recently purchased Lot 74 of the Willow Creek Estates plat. Is that correct? It is, I confirmed. Closed on it last week. Excellent, she said, though her tone suggested it was anything but. She opened the binder, revealing pages of dense text and color-coded tabs. Then I am here to formally welcome you to the community. This is your welcome packet. It contains a copy of our covenants, conditions, and restrictions, our bylaws, and the architectural review guidelines. You'll also find this. She slid a single piece of paper from the front pocket. It was an invoice. That's for the $500 new member initiation fee, plus your first month's prorated dues of $47. We expect prompt payment. I stared at the invoice, then back at her. A slow, simmering annoyance began to build in my chest. I took a deliberate breath, determined to keep this civil. Carol, I appreciate the welcome, but there's a misunderstanding. I only bought the undeveloped lot behind my house. My home, this property, isn't part of your HOA. A thin, unpleasant smile touched her lips. It was the smile of someone who believed they held all the cards. That's where you're mistaken, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. She pointed to a highlighted section in the binder. According to Article 9, Section 4 of our covenants, any and all contiguous parcels or lots owned by a single entity or individual, where at least one of said parcels is subject to these covenants, shall be considered a single, unified property for the purposes of governance by the association. You bought a lot in Willow Creek. Your properties are contiguous. Therefore, your entire 5-acre property is now under the jurisdiction of the HOA. I felt a jolt, not of fear, but of pure, unadulterated disbelief at the sheer audacity. You can't be serious, I said, my voice flatter than I intended. You think because I bought 2 acres of trees you now have the right to tell me what I can and can't do on property my family has owned since the 1940s? The rules are the rules, Mr. Miller, she retorted, her voice hardening. They are in place to protect the aesthetic integrity and property values of our community, a community you are now a part of. Her eyes flicked past me, scanning my property with a critical gaze. For example, she said, her voice taking on a prosecutorial edge. Article 6, Section 2 clearly prohibits the parking of commercial vehicles in driveways or any area visible from the street. That large truck with your business logo on it? That's a violation. That will be a $50 fine. We'll waive it this one time, as a gesture of goodwill, but I expect it to be moved to a garage or an off-site location by tomorrow morning. The politeness I had been clinging to evaporated. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a hostile takeover. Let me be perfectly clear, I said, my voice low and steady. That truck is how I make my living. It's parked on my property, where it has been parked for the last 15 years. You have absolutely no authority here. The only part of my land that touches your association is an empty patch of woods, and I have no plans to do anything with it. You are not fining me, and I am not joining your association. Now I'd appreciate it if you would leave my property. Her face flushed with anger. The mask of bureaucratic civility fell away, revealing the petty tyrant beneath. You will regret this tone, Mr. Miller. I am giving you a chance to comply willingly. If you refuse, we will enforce the covenants to the fullest extent of the law. There will be fines, daily, escalating fines. And if you refuse to pay them, we will place a lien on your entire property. You'll find that it's very difficult to run a business when your assets are frozen. Think about that. She snapped the binder shut. You have 24 hours to move the truck and remit payment for your dues. Without another word, she turned on her heel and marched back to her car, a pristine white luxury sedan that looked as out of place as she did. I stood in my doorway, the invoice clutched in my hand, and watched her drive away. The war had begun. True to her word, the first official notice arrived in my mailbox 2 days later. It was a crisp, professionally printed letter on heavy bond paper, with the Willow Creek Estates HOA logo embossed at the top. It detailed my violations, 1 count of parking a commercial vehicle in a prohibited area, and 1 count of failure to remit initial membership fees and dues. The total fine was $100, with a $50 per day penalty for the truck until the violation is cured. It was absurd. It was infuriating. And it was also, I had to admit, a little intimidating. I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. A week later, a second letter arrived, this time via certified mail, which I had to sign for at the post office. The total was now $450. This letter included a new violation: unapproved landscape alterations, with a grainy photograph of my wife's small vegetable garden near the side of our house. Apparently, our tomato plants and rows of green beans did not meet the aesthetic standards of the community. That was the moment my simmering annoyance boiled over into cold, hard resolve. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was a personal attack. Carol wasn't just enforcing bylaws. She was trying to exert control over my life, to bully me into submission. I decided to do a little reconnaissance. That Saturday, I took a walk through Willow Creek Estates, something I hadn't done in years. The changes were stark. The neighborhood that had once had a comfortable, lived-in feel now looked sterile and uniform. Every lawn was a perfect green carpet. Every mailbox was the same faux bronze monstrosity. There was a distinct lack of personality, of life. It felt less like a community and more like a museum exhibit of suburban living. As I walked, I saw Carol making her rounds in a golf cart, a clipboard in her lap, her eyes scanning every house like a hawk searching for prey. She was a warden patrolling her prison yard. My walk took me past the home of Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow in her 80s who had lived in Willow Creek since it was first built. Her husband had been a passionate birdwatcher, and she had kept his tradition alive, maintaining several bird feeders in her backyard. As I passed, I saw her standing by her front window, looking distressed. On her lawn, near the curb, was a small, laminated sign stuck in the grass. It was an official HOA violation notice. I paused, pretending to tie my shoe, and read it. Violation: prohibited nuisance attraction. Bird feeders are attracting squirrels and other undesirable wildlife in violation of Bylaw 11C. I felt a surge of anger on her behalf. Harassing an 80-year-old woman over a bird feeder was a new level of despicable. I knocked on her door. She opened it a crack, looking nervous. When she saw it was me, she relaxed slightly. "Jack," she said, her voice trembling a little. "It's good to see you." I asked her about the sign, and the story came tumbling out. Carol had been tormenting her for months. First, it was the color of her trim, which was apparently an unapproved shade of white. Then it was a small crack in her driveway. Now it was the bird feeders, which she said were the one thing that brought her joy each day. She'd received fines totaling over $300, a significant sum for someone on a fixed income. "She told me if I don't pay," Mrs. Gable whispered, her eyes welling up, "she'll put a lien on my house. This is the only home I've ever known. I don't know what to do." That was it. That was the moment the fight became about more than just my truck or my garden. It was about protecting a vulnerable neighbor from a bully who got her kicks from tormenting people. I told Mrs. Gable not to worry, that I was looking into the matter, and that she shouldn't pay a single cent. I left her house with a fire in my belly. This wasn't just Carol's problem anymore. This was a community problem, and I was going to be the one to solve it. Other neighbors I spoke to told similar stories, always in hushed tones. They were afraid of Carol, afraid of the fines, the liens, the legal costs. They felt trapped. Carol had successfully created a culture of fear. The next certified letter from the HOA contained a final notice before lien. The alleged debt was now over $1,000. The letter stated that if payment was not received within 30 days, the association's attorneys would file a lien against my property, a public record that would cloud my title and severely impact my ability to secure credit for my business. The threat was no longer abstract, it was real, and it was aimed at my livelihood. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I was out of my depth. It was time to call in a professional. I found a lawyer named Arthur Davies through a recommendation from a contractor I knew. His office was in a modest brick building downtown, a world away from the manicured lawns of Willow Creek. Davies was a man in his late 60s with a fringe of white hair and sharp, intelligent eyes behind thick glasses. He listened patiently as I laid out the whole story, spreading the threatening letters and the invoice across his large mahogany desk. I expected him to laugh, to dismiss it as absurd. He didn't. "I've seen this 100 times," he said, his expression grim as he scanned the documents. HOA boards, particularly new ones led by a reformer, often get drunk on what little power they have. They overreach, they misinterpret the covenants, and they bully residents who don't know their rights. He picked up the letter from Carol. This contiguous property clause is a classic example. It's an aggressive interpretation, and likely not enforceable the way she thinks it is. However, he leaned forward, his gaze serious, that doesn't mean they can't make your life a living hell. Fighting an HOA is a war of attrition. They use the association's funds to pay their lawyers, while you pay out of your own pocket. They can drag this out for years, bleeding you dry until you give up. "So what do I do?" I asked, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. "I'm not going to let her win. Not after what she's doing to Mrs. Gable and the others." Davies nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. "We can fight them on the interpretation of the covenant, and we'd likely win in court eventually. But that's the long, expensive road. There might be a better way." He tapped a finger on the invoice. "The power of an HOA comes from one document, the Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, or the CC&Rs. That document is a deed restriction. It attaches to the land. The key is when it was attached." He looked at me over his glasses. "You said your family has owned your property for a long time." "My grandfather bought it right after the war," I said. "Around 1948, I think." A spark of interest lit up in the lawyer's eyes. "And when was Willow Creek Estates developed?" "The first houses went up in the mid-90s, I believe." Davies smiled, a real smile this time. "Then we have a place to start. An HOA covenant cannot retroactively attach itself to a property that was already a separate, legally deeded parcel before the covenant was created. Her contiguous property rule is irrelevant if your primary property was never part of the land tract that the CC&Rs were placed upon in the first place. She can't force you to join a club you were never eligible for." He leaned back in his chair. "We need to go to the county recorder's office. We need to pull the original plat maps for the development and the entire deed history for your property. If the timeline is what you say it is, we can cut the head off this snake before it even knows what hit it." The next morning, I drove down to the county courthouse, a cavernous old building that smelled of dust and old paper. The recorder's office was in the basement, a vast room filled with towering shelves of heavy, leather-bound books and rows of humming microfilm readers. With guidance from Davies, who had called ahead to a clerk he knew, I began my journey into the past. I felt like a detective on the hunt for a crucial clue. I started with my own property. The clerk helped me find the right ledger, and there it was. In elegant, looping cursive, the record of the deed transfer to my grandfather. The date was clearly stamped, October 17, 1948. It described the 5.2-acre parcel by meets and bounds, a legally distinct entity. A wave of relief washed over me. The first piece of the puzzle was in place. Next, I looked for the creation of Willow Creek Estates. This took more digging. I had to search through the plat maps from the 1990s. Finally, I found it. A massive map dated June 1995, showing the subdivision of a large tract of farmland into 75 lots. I saw the cul-de-sacs, the property lines, and, importantly, Lot 74, the undeveloped parcel I had just bought. I also saw my own property, outlined and labeled as not a part of this plat. The map itself proved my home was excluded. Then I pulled the document I was really looking for, the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions for Willow Creek Estates. It was filed on the same day as the plat map. This was the document that gave the HOA its power. And it was created 47 years after my grandfather's deed was recorded. I felt a surge of triumph. This was the smoking gun. Carol's entire case was built on a foundation of sand. Her authority, which she wielded like a scepter, had no legal basis when it came to my home. I photocopied everything: the 1948 deed, the 1995 plat map, the Declaration of Covenants. As I was packing up my files, a thought occurred to me. On a hunch, I asked the clerk if I could look at the HOA's corporate filings. Since they were a non-profit corporation, their records were public. I spent another hour scrolling through microfilm, looking at their annual reports and meeting minutes. Most of it was boring, procedural stuff. But then I found something interesting in the financial statements for the previous year, the first full year of Carol's presidency. The line item for landscape and grounds maintenance had nearly tripled from the year before. That was odd, considering they hadn't added any new common areas. The vendor listed was a company I'd never heard of, Prestige Lawn and Garden. I jotted down the name. Then I noticed something else. The board meeting minutes from the month they approved the contract were suspiciously vague. The previous landscape company's contract was terminated for performance issues, and the new contract with Prestige was approved without a formal bidding process, which was a violation of their own bylaws. The motion was made by Carol herself and seconded by her vice president. It was all a little too neat. When I got back to my truck, I did a quick search on my phone for Prestige Lawn and Garden. The business was registered to a residential address. Curious, I ran a property search on the address. The owner was listed as one Martin Peterson. A quick social media search confirmed it. Martin Peterson was Carol's brother-in-law. She was funneling HOA money to her own family at inflated rates. This wasn't just bullying, this was potential fraud. The fight had just taken on a whole new dimension. I now had not only a shield to defend myself, but a sword to fight back. I drove straight to Arthur Davies's office, my hands tight on the steering wheel, my mind racing. I spread the copies of the deeds, the plat map, and my notes on the landscaping contract across his desk. He looked them over, his expression shifting from professional interest to genuine excitement. He read the 1948 deed, then the 1995 covenant, and the wide grin spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," he said, leaning back. "This is it, Jack. This is airtight. Her entire legal theory is dead on arrival. Your property is exempt. Period." Then I showed him my notes on the landscaping contract and the brother-in-law connection. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of stern gravity. "Oh, she is a piece of work, isn't she?" he murmured, reading my scribbled notes. "This changes things. This isn't just a legal dispute over covenant interpretation anymore. This is evidence of a breach of fiduciary duty and very likely embezzlement. She's using the members' money to enrich her own family." The new discoveries fundamentally shifted our strategy. We were no longer on the defensive, simply trying to fend off an attack. We were now on the offensive. Mr. Davies spent the rest of the afternoon drafting a letter. It was a masterpiece of legal firepower. It wasn't addressed just to the HOA, but to each board member individually, including Carol, making them personally aware of the situation and its potential consequences. The letter laid out our case in clear, undeniable terms. First, it cited the 1948 deed and the 1995 covenant, complete with copies of the documents as exhibits, and explained, with reference to state law, why the HOA had zero jurisdiction over my primary property. It formally demanded the immediate and permanent cessation of all contact regarding governance, the withdrawal of all fines, and a written apology. It warned them that any attempt to file a lien would be met with a lawsuit for slander of title, for which we would seek significant statutory and punitive damages. Then the letter pivoted. It brought up the matter of the landscaping contract with Prestige Lawn and Garden. It noted the tripling of costs, the lack of a competitive bidding process in violation of their own bylaws, and the familial relationship between Carol Peterson and the company's owner. It didn't outright accuse her of a crime. It was more subtle and far more devastating. It simply raised questions about whether the board was fulfilling its fiduciary duty to its members, and suggested that the members might be interested to know how their dues were being spent. It was the legal equivalent of dropping a lit match into a room full of gasoline. We sent the letter via certified mail, return receipt requested, to the HOA's official address, and to the home addresses of Carol and the other 4 board members. Then we waited. The 30-day deadline on the lien notice was a week away. The clock was ticking. The explosion came 4 days later. My phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously. "Is this Jack Miller?" a man's voice asked. It was one of the other HOA board members, a man named David. His voice was trembling with a mixture of anger and panic. "I just got a letter from your attorney. We're having an emergency board meeting tonight. Carol is losing her mind. She's saying you're trying to destroy the community." "I'm just trying to be left alone," I said calmly, "and I think the members have a right to know what she's doing with their money." There was a pause on the other end. "The landscaping contract, is that true? About her brother-in-law?" "The public records seem to indicate it is," I said. "You can check for yourself." He cursed under his breath. "She told us the other company was unreliable. She said Prestige was the only one that could meet our new quality standards. We just took her at her word." He sighed heavily. "Look, she's calling a special meeting of the full association for next week. She's going to try and get them to approve a special assessment to hire a big law firm to fight you. She's framing you as the villain. You need to be there." "We'll be there," I said, "and we'll be bringing copies." The following week felt like the calm before a storm. Mr. Davies and I prepared. We made 100 copies of the key documents, the 1948 deed, the plat map showing my property as excluded, and the evidence of the suspicious landscaping contract, including the corporate filings for Prestige Lawn and Garden. We also prepared a simple, clear presentation. My goal wasn't to humiliate anyone, though the thought of seeing Carol get her comeuppance was certainly appealing. My goal was to present the undeniable truth and let the community decide for itself. I also spent some time talking to Mrs. Gable and a few other residents who had been bullied by Carol. I told them about the meeting and what we had found. For the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in their eyes. They promised they would be there. The night of the meeting arrived. The community clubhouse, a building that usually hosted potlucks and children's birthday parties, was packed. I'd never seen it so full. Word had clearly spread. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. I saw Mrs. Gable sitting in the front row with her son, her expression determined. Mr. Davies and I found seats near the back, our box of documents resting on the floor between us. Carol and the rest of the board sat at a long table at the front of the room. She looked furious, her face a mask of righteous indignation. She called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of a gavel. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice ringing with forced sincerity. "We are facing a grave threat to the integrity of our community. A new resident," she shot a venomous glare in my direction, "has decided that the rules do not apply to him. He has refused to abide by the covenants that we all live by, the rules that protect our property values and our way of life. Now, he has hired a lawyer to threaten us with frivolous lawsuits, all to avoid paying his fair share." She went on for 10 minutes, painting me as a freeloader and a troublemaker who wanted to tear down everything she had built. She spoke of standards, of unity, of the need to stand firm against those who would defy the will of the community. Finally, she got to the point. "This individual's actions have left us with no choice. We must defend our covenants. I am asking the association tonight to approve a special assessment of $200 per household to create a legal defense fund. It is a small price to pay to protect our investments and our community." A murmur went through the crowd. $200 was not a small price for many of the families there. Before anyone could object, Carol made a calculated move. "In the interest of fairness," she said, a saccharine smile on her face, "I will now allow Mr. Miller to address the community and explain why he believes he is above the rules." She gestured toward the podium. This was her trap. She expected me to stumble, to get emotional, to be intimidated by the crowd she had primed against me. It was my turn. I stood up and walked to the front of the room, my heart pounding, but my resolve firm. But I didn't go to the podium. Instead, I turned to Mr. Davies. "My attorney, Mr. Arthur Davies, will speak on my behalf." Davies walked to the podium with the calm, steady gait of a man who knew he was about to win. He placed his briefcase on the lectern and looked out over the crowd. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm and authoritative. "My name is Arthur Davies. I represent Jack Miller. I'm not here to talk about opinions or feelings. I'm here to talk about facts and the law." He started by addressing Carol's central claim. "Mr. Miller is not a member of your association. He never has been, and by law, he never can be." He then produced a large poster-sized copy of my grandfather's 1948 deed and placed it on an easel. "This is the deed for Mr. Miller's home and his 5 acres of land. It was recorded in 1948. Then, he placed the 1995 HOA Covenant Declaration beside it. "This is your governing document, recorded in 1995. In this state, the law is unequivocally clear. An HOA covenant cannot be attached to a property that pre-exists the creation of that covenant. Mr. Miller's home is, and always has been, legally separate from Willow Creek Estates. The contiguous property rule you've heard about is legally void in this case. It does not apply. End of story." A wave of whispers swept through the room. Carol's face had gone pale. She started to interrupt, but Davies held up a hand. "I'm not finished," he said, his voice firm. "My client's legal immunity is not the only reason we are here tonight. We are also here because this board, under the leadership of its president, has not been acting in your best interest." This was the moment. Davies then told them about the harassment of Mrs. Gable over her bird feeder, and her son stood up and confirmed the story, his voice choked with anger. The mood in the room shifted palpably from confusion to anger. Then, Davies delivered the final blow. "Your HOA dues are meant to serve the community," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "But it's important to ask where that money is going. For example, last year, your landscaping costs nearly tripled. Why? Because your president, Carol Peterson, terminated your old contract and, without seeking competitive bids as required by your own bylaws, awarded a new, much more expensive contract to a company called Prestige Lawn and Garden." He paused for effect. "And who owns Prestige Lawn and Garden?" "Her brother-in-law." The room erupted. It was an explosion of outrage. People were shouting, standing up, pointing at the board table. Carol was on her feet, her face contorted in a mask of fury and panic. "Lies! These are all lies! This is a smear campaign!" she shrieked, but her voice was drowned out by the angry chorus of her neighbors. The other board members looked like they had been struck by lightning. David, the one who had called me, was staring at Carol with an expression of utter betrayal. A man in the front row, whom I later learned was a retired forensic accountant named George, stood up. "I demand a full, independent audit of the last 2 years of financials," he yelled. "Now." "Seconded," another voice roared from the back. Carol banged the gavel, but it was useless. Her authority had completely and utterly collapsed. The meeting descended into chaos. She screamed at the crowd, called them ungrateful, and then, seeing she had lost all control, she grabbed her purse, stormed out of the clubhouse, and sped away in her car. In the aftermath, the remaining board members, looking shell-shocked, voted unanimously to table the special assessment, suspend Carol's presidency effective immediately, and authorize the independent audit George had demanded. Someone had already been on their phone with the non-emergency police line to report a case of potential municipal fraud. The battle was over. The tyrant had been deposed. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity, but for me, it was a quiet, vindicating kind of whirlwind. The interim HOA board, led by David and the retired accountant George, immediately sent me a formal letter. It wasn't just a withdrawal of the fines. It was a profound, multi-page apology. They apologized for the harassment, for the baseless legal threats, and for the stress they had caused my family. They explicitly acknowledged that my property was not, and never would be, under their jurisdiction. The war was officially over, and the peace treaty was written entirely on my terms. They also sent a separate, hand-delivered apology to Mrs. Gable and expunged all the ridiculous fines from her record. The independent audit, as expected, was a bloodbath for Carol. It turned out the situation was even worse than we had suspected. It wasn't just inflated rates to her brother-in-law's company. The audit uncovered a series of completely fabricated invoices for work that was never performed. There were charges for tree trimming in common areas that still had dead branches, invoices for mulching flower beds that were full of weeds, and a massive bill for aeration and overseeding of a common field that residents confirmed had never been touched. She had embezzled nearly $30,000 from her neighbors in just over a year. With the audit results in hand, the board turned the entire file over to the district attorney's office. The gears of actual justice, not the petty facsimile Carol had tried to wield, began to turn. An investigator contacted me and Mr. Davies, and we provided him with all our documentation and a timeline of the events. A few weeks later, the local paper ran a small story on an inside page. Local HOA president charged with embezzlement. Carol Peterson was formally arrested and charged with multiple counts of felony fraud and theft by deception. The legal process dragged on for the better part of a year. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence from the audit, Carol ultimately accepted a plea bargain. She pleaded guilty to a lesser felony charge to avoid a lengthy prison sentence. The judge wasn't lenient. She was sentenced to 5 years of probation, ordered to pay full restitution of the stolen $30,000 to the HOA, and had to complete 500 hours of community service. The felony on her record meant she could never again hold a position of trust, or any decent job for that matter. To pay the restitution and her own substantial legal fees, she and her husband were forced to sell their house in Willow Creek. The for sale sign that went up on their lawn felt like the final, satisfying punctuation mark on a long and ugly chapter. With Carol gone, Willow Creek Estates underwent a renaissance. The community, galvanized by the fight, was more engaged than ever before. They elected a new board with George, the retired accountant, as president. Their first order of business was a complete overhaul of the covenants and bylaws. They hired Mr. Davies to help them redraft the documents, transforming them from a weapon of oppression into a simple, common-sense framework for maintaining the neighborhood. The ridiculous rules were purged. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement to neighborly cooperation. The hideous bronze mailboxes were no longer mandatory. Pink flamingos were quietly tolerated. The atmosphere of fear evaporated, replaced by the friendly, relaxed vibe the neighborhood had once been known for. Property values, which had actually stagnated under Carol's reign of terror, began to rise again. 2 years passed. Life returned to a state of blessed normalcy. My business was thriving, my family was happy, and my property line was once again just a quiet boundary, not a battlefront. The 2 acres of woodland I had bought remained a wild and peaceful buffer, a silent testament to the fight for peace. The residents of Willow Creek became true neighbors. We'd have barbecues that straddled the property line, and I was often hired by folks in the HOA for landscaping and excavation projects, always paid fairly and on time. Mrs. Gable's backyard was a flurry of activity, with more bird feeders than ever, and no one said a word, other than to comment on the beauty of the cardinals and goldfinches. I saw Carol one last time. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was at a discount grocery store on the other side of the county, picking up some supplies. As I stood in the checkout line, I glanced over at the next register, and there she was. She looked smaller, diminished. Her hair was no longer perfectly coiffed, and she wore the drab uniform of the store. The crisp pantsuit and aura of untouchable authority were gone, replaced by a weary, hollowed-out expression. She was scanning items with a detached, mechanical motion, her face a blank mask. Our eyes met for a fleeting second. I saw a flicker of recognition, followed by a wave of shame that washed over her face. She immediately looked down, focusing intently on the barcode of a can of beans. She didn't say anything, and neither did I. In that moment, I felt no anger, no triumph, just a quiet, detached sense of pity for a person whose obsession with power had cost her everything. Looking back on it all now, the whole ordeal feels both surreal and profoundly clarifying. I never wanted to be a community champion or a reluctant hero. I'm a man who likes dirt under his fingernails and the simple logic of a well-dug foundation. But when I was pushed, when my peace was threatened and I saw a good person being bullied, I found a strength I didn't know I had. The experience taught me a valuable lesson about the nature of power. Petty tyrants like Carol thrive in the dark. They feed on the apathy and fear of others. They weaponize rules not to create order, but to feed their own egos. Their power seems absolute, until one person decides to turn on the lights and read the fine print. The real victory wasn't just in defeating her, it was in what came after. It was in the restoration of community, the reforging of trust between neighbors. It was in proving that a handful of determined people, armed with the truth and a good lawyer, can dismantle a corrupt system and build something better in its place. The law, which Carol had tried to use as a club to beat us into submission, ultimately became our shield and our sword. She thought the rules were her allies, but she forgot that the most fundamental rules, the ones about fairness, property rights, and not stealing from your neighbors, were on our side all along. Today, as I sit on my back porch, I can hear the distant sound of children playing in the Willow Creek cul-de-sac and the cheerful chirping of the birds in Mrs. Gable's yard. My excavator sits quietly in the workshop, ready for the next job. The boundary between my land and the neighborhood next door is invisible, marked only by a line of old oak trees. There are no more threatening letters, no more angry confrontations. There is only peace. And I know now, more than ever, that it's a peace worth fighting for.